Ambassador Jinwoo stood in the center of the massive chamber. His hands bound by glowing energy shackles that buzzed with alien technology. The chains felt cold against his skin, but he kept his back straight and his head high. He would not give these creatures the satisfaction of seeing him break. The Galactic Council's tribunal stretched out before him like a nightmare made real. The chamber was so vast that he could barely see the far walls, and the ceiling disappeared into darkness above. 47 different alien species sat in judgment of him, their forms so strange and terrifying that even after 3 years among them, Jinwoo still felt his heart race when he looked at them. Some of the council members glowed with their own inner light, their transparent bodies pulsing with colors that hurt to look at directly. Others looked like living crystals, their faceted surfaces reflecting the chamber's eerie blue lighting in thousands of tiny rainbows. A few resembled giant insects, their compound eyes fixed on him with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. Jinwoo had been Earth's ambassador to this cosmic assembly for 3 long years. 3 years of watching his people's hopes and dreams crushed under the weight of alien arrogance. Every request humanity had made had been denied. Trade agreements that would have brought prosperity to Earth's colonies rejected. Territorial recognition for the world's humans had settled.
Denied.
Even basic diplomatic courtesy had been refused with increasing hostility. The elder species of the galaxy looked at humanity and saw only a plague. They whispered among themselves about how quickly humans spread across the stars, how they claimed worlds and built cities where more worthy civilizations should have expanded instead. To them, humanity was nothing more than an infestation to be controlled or eliminated. Now they had found their excuse. The charges they had brought against him were lies, every single one of them. Terrorism, they said, sedition against the cosmic order, violation of the sacred cosmic accords that governed all civilized species. Jinwoo knew the truth, though. He had never committed any of these crimes. The evidence against him had been manufactured, the witnesses bought or coerced. But the council didn't care about truth. They had made their decision long before this trial began. This was all just theater, a show put on for the galaxy to watch. They wanted everyone to see what happened to species that dared to challenge the established order. The executioner stepped forward, a towering figure in black robes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. In its hands, it carried a weapon that looked like a sword made of pure energy. The blade hummed with power, casting dancing shadows on the chamber walls. Jinwoo closed his eyes for a moment and thought of home. He thought of Earth's blue skies and white clouds, of the children playing in parks who would never know the stars if these creatures had their way. He thought of the human colonies scattered across the galaxy, all of them now in danger because of what was about to happen here. When he opened his eyes again, he was calm. The executioner raised the energy blade high above its head, and the chamber fell silent. Even the alien representatives stopped their chittering and buzzing to watch. But Jinwoo had one last card to play. Hidden deep in his brain, so small that even the council's advanced scanners had missed it, was a quantum communicator. It was technology that humanity had developed in secret, technology that the aliens didn't even know existed. As the energy blade began to descend toward his neck, Jinwoo activated the device with a thought. Pain shot through his skull as the communicator burned out his neural pathways, but he managed to send one final message across the vast distance to Earth. Protocol 7 confirmed. They chose war. The words traveled faster than light, carried by quantum entanglement 2 receivers waiting in the Sol system. By the time the energy blade separated Jinwoo's head from his shoulders, his message had already reached its destination. The execution was broadcast live across the galaxy on every communication channel. The council wanted all species to see what happened to those who defied them. They wanted to spread fear, to make sure that no other young race would dare to challenge their authority. But they had made a terrible mistake. They thought they knew humanity. They thought they understood what humans were capable of. They had watched Earth's military exercises and dismissed them as primitive. They had seen humanity's ships and laughed at their simple designs. They had studied human culture and decided that these creatures were too soft. was too divided, too weak to pose any real threat. What the Council didn't know was that humanity had been preparing for this moment since first contact, from the very beginning, when it became clear that the galaxy's so-called civilized species had built their peace on the backs of younger races. Humanity had been planning for war. They had studied every species in the Council. They had mapped their weaknesses, learned their fears, and prepared weapons that the aliens couldn't even imagine.
Most importantly, they had made contact with forces in the galaxy that the Council had forgotten existed.
The execution of Ambassador Ginwu was meant to be the end of humanity's dreams. Instead, it became the beginning of their nightmare. The sleeping giant was about to wake up, and when it did, the galaxy would never be the same again. Admiral Dong Haiyan was sitting in his office on Luna Base when the message arrived. The quantum communicator on his desk suddenly came to life, its crystal surface glowing with an urgent red light. He had been waiting for this moment for 3 years, hoping it would never come, but knowing that it probably would. The message was short and terrible. Protocol 7 confirmed. They chose war. The words came from Jinwu, Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Council. But Dong Haiyan could hear the pain in the transmission. He knew that Ginwu was already dead by the time these words reached him. For a moment, the Admiral sat in silence, feeling the weight of what was about to happen settle on his shoulders like a heavy coat. He was 57 years old and had spent his entire adult life in the military. He had trained for this day, planned for it, dreamed about it in his worst nightmares. Now it was here, and there was no turning back. Dong Haiyan stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the gray surface of the moon. Earth hung in the black sky like a blue jewel, beautiful and fragile. Soon, both worlds would be at war with creatures that could destroy them with a thought. But humanity would not go quietly into the darkness. He pressed a button on his desk, and alarms began to sound throughout the base. Red lights flashed in every corridor, and soldiers ran to their positions. War rooms that had been sealed for decades suddenly opened their doors, revealing banks of computers and communication, equipment that hummed to life. The Doomsday Protocol was not just a military plan. It was humanity's declaration that they would fight to the last breath rather than accept extinction. Every human in the solar system had a role to play. From the miners in the asteroid belt to the farmers on Mars, within minutes, reports began flooding in from across the Sol system. On Ceres, the largest asteroid in the belt, mining operations that had been running for 50 years suddenly revealed their true purpose. The Council had always dismissed these facilities as primitive resource gathering, but they were wrong. Hidden beneath the surface were weapons factories that had been building in secret for decades. The generation ships were the next surprise. These massive vessels had left Earth 30 years ago, supposedly carrying colonists to distant worlds, where they could start new lives. The Council had watched them go with amusement, thinking that humanity was giving up and running away. But now those same ships were changing course, turning toward Council strongholds scattered across the galaxy. Each generation ship carried 50,000 humans, but they were not just colonists. They were soldiers, scientists, and engineers who had spent their entire lives preparing for this war. Ships themselves were not just transports. They were mobile weapons platforms disguised as civilian vessels, armed with technology that the Council had never seen before. But the most terrifying development was happening at the edge of the solar system. Deep space monitoring stations that humanity had claimed were for scientific research began broadcasting signals into the void. These were not ordinary radio waves or laser communications. There was something else entirely, something that bent space and time in ways that should not have been possible. The signals were aimed at empty space between the stars, at regions where the Council's maps showed nothing but cosmic dust and radiation. But humanity's maps were different. They showed something vast and ancient sleeping in those dark places, something that had been waiting for millions of years for the right moment to wake up. On the Council's homeworld of Nexus Prime, intelligence. Officers began receiving reports that made their blood run cold. Human space, which had seemed quiet and peaceful just hours before, was suddenly alive with activity. Ships were moving, weapons were being armed, and entire populations were mobilizing for war. The Council had made a terrible mistake. They had assumed that humanity's military capabilities were limited to defending their own solar system. They had seen Earth's armies and navies and dismissed them as primitive and weak. They had watched human war movies and laughed at the crude weapons and simple tactics. But they had never understood that humans had been studying warfare for thousands of years. Every battle in human history, from the ancient conflicts fought with sticks and stones to the modern wars fought with nuclear weapons, had taught humanity something about the art of destruction. They had learned from every defeat, adapted to every challenge, and prepared for every possible enemy. The alien species that made up the Galactic Council were old and powerful, but they had been at peace for so long that they had forgotten how to truly fight. Their wars were ritualized affairs, governed by ancient rules and customs that limited casualties and preserved infrastructure. They fought like gentlemen, with honor and dignity. Humanity did not fight like gentlemen. They fought like cornered animals, with desperation and cunning and absolute determination to survive. They would use every weapon available to them, break every rule of civilized warfare, and sacrifice everything they had to win. The sleeping giant was waking up, and its first roar would shake the foundations of the galaxy. The Council had wanted to make an example of humanity, to show other young species what happened to those who challenged the established order. Instead, they had unleashed something that would change everything forever. The first attack came without warning, and in a way that no one on the Council had ever imagined. There were no massive warships appearing in the sky, no armies of soldiers storming through space stations. Instead, tiny clouds of what looked like silver dust began to appear around Council worlds. At first, the alien defense forces didn't even notice them. The clouds were so small that they barely registered on sensors, and they moved so slowly that they seemed harmless. But within hours, something terrible began to happen. On the mining world of Kepler-7, the orbital defense platforms suddenly went dark. Engineers rushed to investigate, but when they arrived, they found something impossible. The massive metal structures were simply dissolving, steel and composite materials breaking down into tiny particles that floated away like smoke. The particles weren't random debris. They were moving with purpose, forming into new clouds that spread out across the planet's surface. As they touched buildings, vehicles, and equipment, everything began to fall apart. But the materials weren't being destroyed. They were being converted into more of the tiny machines. These were nanobots, microscopic robots so small that millions of them could fit on the head of a pin. They had been launched from the generation ships that everyone thought were carrying peaceful colonists. The Council had watched those ships pass through their territory for years, never suspecting that they were actually weapons platforms in disguise. The nanobots were unlike anything the Council had ever encountered. Energy weapons that could melt through the thickest armor had no effect on them. Electromagnetic pulses that could disable entire fleets passed through them harmlessly. Even nuclear weapons only scattered them temporarily before they regrouped and continued their work. Worse, the nanobots were learning. Every time the Council tried a new defense, the tiny machines adapted within hours. They analyzed the countermeasures, found weaknesses, and developed immunities. What had started as a few small clouds quickly became a plague that spread from world to world. On Nexus Prime, the Council's capital world, Chancellor Kungman stood in her command center watching the disaster unfold. She was a member of the Altarian species, tall and elegant, with skin that shimmered like oil on water. Her people had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years. She had never seen anything like this. The planet's orbital defense grid was one of the most advanced in the galaxy. Massive satellites armed with weapons that could destroy entire fleets formed a protective shell around the world. But as Kunman watched, the satellites began to simply disappear. It wasn't an explosion or a battle. The metal structures were dissolving from the inside out, their materials being converted into more nanobots. The tiny machines swarmed around each satellite like a silver fog, consuming everything in their path. Within hours, the entire defense network was gone, replaced by clouds of nanobots that began descending toward the planet's surface. How is this possible? Kyung Min whispered to her aide, a crystalline being whose body chimed softly when it moved. Our intelligence reports said the humans had primitive technology, simple rockets and chemical weapons. The aide's crystal body flickered with nervous energy. Chancellor, we're receiving similar reports from across the galaxy. The nanobots are appearing on every council world simultaneously. Our fleets are trying to respond, but the aide's words were cut off as new reports flooded in. The nanobots had been just the beginning. Human fleets were emerging from hidden bases throughout the galaxy, and they were unlike anything the Council had ever seen. The ships didn't look like traditional spacecraft. Instead of the bulky, angular designs favored by Council species, human vessels were sleek and organic-looking. They seemed to flow through space like living things, their hulls rippling and changing shape as they moved. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to bend the space around them, making it impossible to track their movements or predict their attacks. The human ships struck without warning and vanished before anyone could fight back. They would appear out of nowhere, destroy a space station or military base, and then simply disappear. By the time Council forces arrived to investigate, they found only wreckage and spreading clouds of nanobode. The attacks were happening everywhere. At once, trade routes that had been secure for centuries were suddenly cut off. Military bases that had stood for thousands of years were reduced to rubble in minutes. Communication networks that connected the galaxy were being systematically destroyed. But the worst part was the realization that was slowly dawning on the Council leadership. This wasn't a hastily planned revenge attack. This was a coordinated campaign that had been in preparation for decades. Every diplomatic mission that humans had sent to Council worlds had been gathering intelligence. Every trade negotiation had been a chance to map defenses and identify weaknesses. Every cultural exchange had allowed human agents to study Council technology and find ways to counter it. The humans had been playing a game that the Council didn't even know existed, while the aliens had been focused on their ancient rituals and political maneuvering. Humanity had been preparing for war on a scale that defied imagination. Chancellor Kungmin stared at the tactical displays showing the collapse of her civilization and felt something she had never experienced before: fear. The Council had ruled the galaxy for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to be threatened. Now they were facing an enemy that fought by rules they didn't understand. Using weapons they couldn't counter, the humans had been underestimated, dismissed as primitive savages who posed no real threat. That mistake was about to cost the Council everything they had built over millions of years. The Council fleets were in chaos. Their once mighty armadas scattered across the galaxy like frightened birds, desperately trying to respond to humanity's relentless assault. Admiral Vorth of the Centaurian Navy had commanded ships for 300 years, but he had never seen anything like this. His vessels were being destroyed faster than he could count them, and the enemy seemed to be everywhere at once. But in the deep void between star systems, something was happening that no one in the Council understood. The signals that humanity's deep space stations had been broadcasting into empty space were finally getting an answer. The response didn't come from across the galaxy like a normal radio transmission. It came from somewhere much stranger, from across time itself. In the darkness between the stars, ancient structures began to wake up. They had been sleeping for millions of years, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. These were not the ruins of a dead civilization. They were living constructs, ships the size of small planets that existed partially outside normal space and time. The predecessors had returned. Admiral Dong Hayan was on the bridge of his flagship when it happened. He was studying battle reports, trying to coordinate humanity's complex war plan, when suddenly everything around him went silent. The bridge crew stopped moving, frozen in place like statues. The lights dimmed, and a presence filled the room that made the air itself feel heavy. A figure appeared in front of him, but it wasn't really there. It was made of pure energy, shifting and flowing like liquid light. When it spoke, the words, came directly into his mind without passing through his ears. "We have been waiting for you," the being said. Its voice was ancient beyond measure, carrying the weight of eons. "We have been watching your species since you first reached for the stars." Donghayan tried to speak, but found that he couldn't move his lips. The entity seemed to understand his confusion and continued, "We are the predecessors. We built the first civilization in this galaxy, long before any of the council species evolved past primitive hunters.
We created the technologies that they
now use, established the trade routes they travel, and laid the foundations for everything they call advanced." Images flooded Donghayan's mind. He saw vast cities that spanned entire star systems, ships that could travel between galaxies in the blink of an eye, and beings of incredible power and wisdom. This was the civilization that had vanished into legend millions of years ago, leaving behind only ruins and mysteries. "We did not die," the predecessor explained. "We transcended. We moved beyond the need for physical form, beyond the limitations of matter and energy. But we did not abandon this galaxy. We have been testing every species that arose after us, waiting to see if any would prove worthy of our inheritance." Being gestured, and more images appeared. Donghayan saw the council species in their early days, young and full of potential. He watched as they discovered predecessor technology, used it to build their empire, and then grew fat and lazy with success. "The council species had their chance," the predecessor continued. "We gave them our knowledge, our tools, our wisdom, but they became stagnant. They stopped exploring, stopped learning, stopped growing. They turned our gifts into chains, using them to suppress younger species instead of lifting them up."
Gongyan
Finally found his voice in humanity. Humanity's different. "In your short time among the stars, you have shown the qualities we have been seeking. You adapt to every challenge. You create solutions where none existed before. Most importantly, you refuse to surrender, even when facing impossible odds." The predecessor's form brightened, and suddenly Donghayan could see beyond the bridge of his ship. He saw the galaxy spread out before him like a map, with human nanobots swarming across council worlds and human ships striking at their enemies from impossible angles. "Your species has impressed us," the being said. "But this is only the beginning of the test. We offer you something that the council never earned access to: our true technology. Not the simple tools they stumbled upon, but the real power that built galaxies." Images of incredible weapons filled Donghayan's mind. He saw devices that could restructure matter at the quantum level, changing the fundamental nature of reality itself. He saw ships that traveled through dimensions the council didn't even know existed, moving faster than light by stepping outside of normal space entirely. "We will also give you the knowledge to awaken others," the predecessor continued. "Are dozens of species across the galaxy that the council has suppressed, keeping them primitive and weak. With our help, you can free them and give them the chance to reach their potential." The offer was overwhelming, but Donghayan sensed that it came with a price. "What do you want from us?" "Proof that you can build something better than what you are destroying. The council ruled through fear and oppression. If you simply replace them with another human empire, you will have failed our test. You must show that you can create a civilization based on growth, exploration, and the elevation of all species." The predecessor's form began to fade, but its voice remained strong. "The tools we offer you will ensure victory over the council, but what you do with that victory will determine whether humanity is truly worthy of our legacy. Choose wisely, Admiral. The fate of the galaxy depends on it." The presence vanished, leaving Donghayan alone on his bridge. Around him, his crew began to move again, unaware that anything had happened. But everything had changed. Humanity now had allies older than the galaxy itself, and weapons that could reshape reality. The war against the council was about to enter a new phase. The final battle was unlike anything anyone had ever experienced. There were no ships firing weapons at each other, no armies marching across battlefields, no explosions lighting up the darkness of space. Instead, the fight took place in a realm that existed beyond normal reality. In the quantum space where thoughts became weapons and ideas could reshape the universe itself, Admiral Han found himself standing in what looked like an endless, white void. He could see other figures in the distance, but they seemed to shift and change as he watched them. These were the leaders of the Council's elder species, their consciousness pulled into this strange battlefield by the predecessors. Technology, he wasn't alone. Around him, other human commanders appeared one by one. Captain Minho from the Mars Defense Force, Commander Hyjin from the asteroid mining fleets, and dozens of others who had fought in humanity's war against the Council. They all looked confused and frightened, but they were ready to fight, across. From them, the Council's representatives took shape. These weren't their physical bodies, but manifestations of their will and consciousness. They appeared as towering figures of crystal and light, their forms radiating power that had been built up over millions of years of galactic dominance. The battle began without warning. The Council leaders attacked with thoughts shaped into weapons, sending waves of mental energy that could have destroyed entire planets. But something strange happened when these attacks reached the humans. Instead of being crushed, the human minds bent and flowed around the assault like water around a rock, where the Council saw fixed rules that couldn't be broken. Humans saw puzzles to be solved, but the aliens relied on ancient patterns of thought. That had worked for eons, humans improvised and found new ways to fight. The quantum realm responded to creativity and adaptability, and these were humanity's greatest strengths. Dong Haeon watched in amazement as his fellow humans began to outmaneuver opponents who had thousands of years more experience. Turned a Council attack into a defensive barrier by thinking about it differently. Commander Hyjin created weapons from pure imagination that the aliens couldn't understand or counter. The Council representatives grew desperate. They had ruled the galaxy for so long that they had forgotten how to truly struggle. Their minds had become rigid, locked into ways of thinking that had worked in the past, but couldn't adapt to this new kind of warfare. But the humans had grown up struggling. Every generation had faced challenges that forced them to think in new ways. They had learned to survive by being creative, by refusing to accept that problems couldn't be solved, by finding hope even in the darkest situations. As the battle raged on, something unexpected began to happen. The predecessor's technology wasn't just allowing humans to fight in this quantum realm. It was offering something much more powerful, the chance to transform reality itself. Dong Haeon realized that they didn't need to destroy the Council to win. They could change them instead. The same technology that had created this battlefield could rewrite the fundamental nature of every species in the galaxy, giving them all the chance to grow beyond their current limitations. The victory didn't come through violence. It came through transformation. The quantum energy that filled the battlefield began to spread outward, touching every world where Council species lived. But instead of destroying them, it gave them something they had lost long ago: the ability to change and grow. Species that had been locked in the same patterns of thought for millions of years suddenly found themselves able to think in new ways. Civilizations that had stagnated began to explore and discover again. The rigid barriers that had kept different species apart began to crumble. But the transformation wasn't limited to the Council species. The predecessor's technology reached out to dozens of other races that had been suppressed and held back by the Galactic Order. Primitive species that had been kept from advancing suddenly found themselves able to reach for the stars. Humanity didn't become the galaxy's new rulers. They became its liberators. Using the predecessor technology, they broke down the barriers that had kept species isolated and hostile toward each other. They shared knowledge instead of hoarding it, encouraged exploration instead of limiting it, and celebrated diversity instead of trying to control it. The galaxy that emerged from this transformation was nothing like the old Council Empire. It was chaotic and unpredictable, with dozens of species all growing and changing in different directions. Some found this frightening, but others saw it as the most exciting thing that had ever happened. Years passed, and the effects of the transformation became clear. On worlds throughout the galaxy, children of different species played together and learned from each other. Human children grew up speaking alien languages, while alien children learned human games and songs. They represented something the galaxy had never seen before: a truly integrated civilization. where being different was seen as a strength rather than a weakness. The execution of Ambassador Jin Woo, which the Council had intended as a warning to keep other species in line, had instead become the catalyst for the galaxy's greatest transformation. His final transmission hadn't just triggered a military response. It had awakened something that refused to be contained, the human spirit of determination and hope. In the end, humanity's greatest victory wasn't conquering the galaxy. It was freeing it. The sleeping giant that had awakened wasn't just humanity's military might. It was their ability to dream of a better future and make it real, no matter how impossible it seemed. The galaxy would never be the same again, and that was exactly what it needed.